Hey guys, TKC here, the Kaijudo Channel. Welcome to another episode of Kaijudo Rankings. This is week 2 of the spring 2014 season of KMCs. So let's get straight to it. Let's go check out the top 5 rising and dropping deck archetypes. Starting with the top 5 rising decks, we actually have a brand new archetype to add to the list, which is really exciting. Check out the top 5 right here. We got Light Water Corrupted Tempo in first with a plus 5% increase because it's a brand new archetype. We also have Light Water Nature Tempo, which is the second most rising deck. 5-step Control, of course, is being played everywhere. Blurple Control is another new archetype in a way. It's a Blurple Kalima, actually. And we also have Light Water Nature Control. So I'm going to go and take a moment to talk about this Light Water Corrupted deck, which is piloted none other than John Johnson. He actually went on to top 8 both KMCs this weekend back-to-back, since one was Saturday and one was Sunday. He decided to go to both KMCs and use this Light Water Corrupted list. He made a few changes between the two KMCs, but overall he got 2 top 8 performances, 1 top 8 and 1 top 4, which is very impressive. It's very similar to the Light Water Fire Corrupted lists that I've seen out there in the LCQs and stuff like that, but basically just take out the fire and then just add more corrupteds in the light water section and then just more, you know, tempo-y stuff. I would suggest you go check out the deck on my website, KaijudoChannel.com. Go ahead and click the tournaments, and then click either of the 2 KMCs. I suggest the more recent one, which would be Garden City in Michigan. Then go ahead and go to the top 4, click John Johnson's deck, and check out what's in there. It's really cool. It's got a lot of corrupted stuff. It has Fallen Keeper. It had Snow Fort in the original build, which is kind of neat, but then that got scrapped, and overall it's a really cool deck, and I highly suggest you check it out. Blurple Control was another really cool deck here. That was piloted by Sawyer Lefebvre at the first KMC, which was in Illinois, and his deck was quite interesting. Most Kalima lists tend to go towards light or nature, but this one actually went ahead and went towards water, which is nice, because you get to play with Squillis Scourge, you get to play with Grip of Despair, Freakish Test Subject, and then he also added a splash of General Finbar in case he wanted to be the tempo matchup and just, you know, out-tempo other pile control and stuff like that. So I suggest you check out his list as well. Very cool deck. But now we're going to go and check out the top 5 dropping decks. These are the ones that haven't been showing up lately, and in first on this list is Light Water Dark Fire Dragons, followed by Light Water Dark Tempo, Light Water Dark Control, which is pretty much like Light Water Dark Kalima mostly, Light Water Fire Dragons, and Mono Fire Rush. Now, Dragons is definitely the key deck to look out for here, because Dragons didn't top 8 at all this weekend in both KMCs, absolutely absent from these top 8s. Now, this is interesting because the championships way back in November was won with Dragons, and ever since then, Dragons really hasn't done much. I mean, he got like a first place at, you know, the Montreal Abyss tournament here. He got second place at a Kerwin's Game Store 1K. But then after that, it just kind of disappeared and it's gone. But with the huge popularity of tempo in this format, I'm kind of surprised that Dragons, you know, isn't really doing too well. Maybe people aren't trying it. I know there are people out there that I know for sure they are trying Dragons, but I guess they're just, you know, not doing well somehow. I can see how control decks do kind of keep the dragon decks in check, but if you play dragons right, you could actually just like out-tempo control just out of nowhere. You know, if you use cards like Keeper of Laws and General Finbar in your dragon deck, you can just like win out of nowhere because you're just annoying the control deck with like your Keeper of Laws, your birds, and then dragons are there so they can't play blockers. So you kind of like, you know, give them a bit of a headache with all those kinds of cards. So I think Dragons is well positioned right now, but I guess it's just not doing well, or people are just not really wanting to try it because they just want to use Tempo or Control or even Rush, which is doing quite well. However, next weekend there are 5 KMCs instead of the usual 2, so I do expect Dragons to pop up back again, and I don't know if they'll be doing very well. But I'm just going to go out on the limb and I'm going to say Dragons are going to do very well next weekend. Let's see if that prediction sticks. So next we're going to move on to the cards themselves. And now this week I just want to point out that the changes in the cards are really not as severe as last week's. Because last week's it was like a completely, you know, huge gap between tournaments. And now we have, you know, consistent KMCs week by week. And these card changes, like right now, it doesn't vary by much. I believe in the last episode, there are cards that change by like more than 1%, which is actually quite huge. But in this week, we have like all the changes are less than 1%. So right now, all these changes are quite negligible and, you know, not much of a huge difference. So take these stats with a grain of salt because they're not like, you know, the absolute biggest changes in the world, but there's still something to take notice of, I guess. So starting with the top 5 rising creatures, this is interesting because this is pretty much the opposite of last week most of these creatures on this list right here are from Light Water Nature Tempo decks. And if you remember last episode, all those cards in the dropping creatures were also Light Water Nature Tempo cards. So I believe Light Water Nature Tempo has actually done a bit better this week. The first on the list is Manapod Beetle by, not much, by like 0.03% more than the other cards on the list. So no, this is not like a huge metagame shift. Manapod Beetle's always been around. It's not like the new biggest thing. Let's go ahead and look at the other cards here. We have Humakuon the Blaster, Grudge Weaver. I believe that's because of Kalima decks, or just a lot of control decks are actually like just throwing in Grudge Weavers with like Ripper Reaper and stuff like that. As a matter of fact, Robert Arguelles, who won the Illinois KMC, used a variant of the Huda Big Stuff deck, and it was similar-ish, but it had like a lot more blockers. It had Grudge Weaver, it had Ripper Reaper. It was like, I guess in his words, it was basically like a really consistent list. It was like everything was like 3 of or 2 of at least. And, there's a bunch of blockers, so he was probably really good against Rush. But yeah, I don't know, I just kind of noticed that Grudge Reaver was, popping up in a little bit more list than usual. We also have Tricky Turnip and Cyber Scamp, which of course, also in Light Water Nature Tempo decks. And then coming in a close 6th, which I don't see here, is Keeper of Laws. And I did mention that Keeper of Laws is probably like a card that should be having an increase in play, and it did, thankfully. Apparently from people who were attending these events this weekend, they said that Keeper of Laws was all over the place on the tables, so I guess Keeper of Laws is kind of making a comeback now. The control is just like running wild all over everything. And now for the top 5 dropping creatures, and once again, this is very similar to the Rising of last week. So we have Aqua Strider in first by quite a big lead here. Cyber Trader, Cyber Sprite, Emperor Neuron, and then Spire Puppet. So the Trader Sprite Neuron, I believe, was in the Rising creatures last week. And I guess this week, well, I believe there was maybe 1 Blurple Tempo this weekend. I'm not really sure exactly. I think there was in the second KMC, the Michigan one. Now, the thing I do want to point out, though, is Aqua Strider. Once again, this is not a really huge change, but I do want to point out that this weekend actually did have less control decks making the top 8 than last week. Also, not to mention, the Tempo decks from this week didn't use Aqua Strider. They just kind of stuck with the Raincloud Kraken, and that's it. If you look at the Tempo decks from last week, you see a lot of splashed Aqua Striders, or maybe even just 3, like a Light Water Dark Tempo. Would probably like to use 2 or 3. Whereas the Light Water Nature Tempo deck, pretty much like Carl Machoto's version, Earth Power, he used only 1 in his deck, and then he eventually cut it out of his list completely. So I think people are catching on that Strider isn't like a huge necessity in Tempo. You just kind of need Raincloud Kraken because it does the same thing as Strider. It just has 1,000 less power, but it's still an Enforcer, it's still level 2 blocker, and there you go. And lastly, we're going to move on to the spells here. We have the top 5 Rising spells right here. And also something that I did mention last week, Stormspark Blast should have an increase in play, and there it is, right there. The highest increase of a card this weekend was Stormspark Blast. Awesome stuff. We also have Oathsworn Call, Reap and Sow, Piercing Judgment, and then Mark of Eternal Haven. Don't really look at that one too much. That one's tied with Deep Mind Probe, actually, but that's only because, well, it's a card that hasn't been used lately, and people top 80 with it. So, Stormspark Blast, interesting fact about that, 12 out of the 16 deck lists this weekend use Stormspark Blast. That's actually a very huge number. And I believe right now, on the top 10 cards period, Stormspark Blast is now number 3. I believe Aqua Strider was number 2, and then Stormspark Blast kind of jumped up. Same with Piercing Judgment. They just kind of both bunny hopped over the Aqua Strider, and now Aqua Strider is 4th, and you'll see that at the end of the video. I also want to point out the Oathsworn Call here. That's also a neat little increase here. Oathsworn Call is actually used in quite a lot of different decks. It was mainly used in the Light Water Nature Tempo deck, so you will see it in Mega Bugs, you will see it in just standard Light Water Nature Tempo, but you actually do see it in control decks as well. It's kind of nice to have a turn 5 Ramnoth or Lyra or, things like that. Even like Razor Kindred Puppet is kind of like a neat option. You just have like a blocker that reveals their hand, you discard a card, and there you go. And I believe CVH was the one who kind of developed this neat little tech and control, so props to you, CVH. And yeah, Stormspark Blast and Oathsworn Call making huge increases in play here. And then moving on to the top 5 dropping spells, I think these are all completely irrelevant, so I wouldn't really look into these too much, but I'm just going to post it here. Anyway, here's the list. We have Crystal Memory in first, then Terror Pit, then Logo Scan, Grip of Despair, and Jump Jets. I don't know really how to explain this. Terror Pit, don't look at that decrease too much. It is still the #1 card in Kaijudo right now. It is just used in so many decks, and it's winning all over the place. I think the decrease in Terror Pit is because of a few lists that actually opted not to use 3, and they decided to just use 2 or even 1. So I found that kind of, strange, because Terror Pit is just awesome. It's like the be-all, end-all removal spell. Just boom, get rid of anything almost, you know, not Haven, not Keeper of Laws most of the time, not Neptus, not Turnip, but hey, it gets rid of pretty much like 95% of the creatures in Kaijudo. So that's pretty much why Turpit is the #1 card. It just pretty much gets rid of pretty much anything. And then if you notice the 5th card on the list, which is Jump Jets, like I said earlier, Dragons has just not been being played lately, and that's why Jump Jets is going down and down and down. So that's it for this week's Kaijudo Rankings. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and things are going to pick up the next 2 weeks because the next 2 weeks have 5 KMCs each. So that's pretty much 10 KMCs to round out the Invasion Earth meta, because then after that, the 5 Mystics set will be fully revealed, it will be fully spoiled, and it will be released, and then the KMCs following the release will be post 5 Mystics. It will be the 5 Mystics meta, which is going to be very, very interesting. Really powerful cards in there, and the meta is probably going to change quite a bit. So with all that said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys got your Booster Brawl product. You can go ahead and get that at your local game store. It's a very, very cool product. I tried it out this Sunday. Very, very fun. Games go really long with this Booster Brawl product, so you have, you know, so many awesome fun times when you play with this product. What I didn't notice inside the product, I didn't really show it or open it, but inside you actually have another mode that you can play that's different than the one that was preview to Champs. You can actually go ahead and draft with this thing. Not just like draft and play, but you just simply draft, make your deck, and then you play, which is really, really cool. Alright guys, TKC here, signing off. See you later guys. Thank you all for watching. Lists are showing up right now.